Iniciamos la conferencia de hoy, una vez más, tratando el tema de puertas dimensionales y en su parte número 67, donde vamos a tratar más o menos la continuación de lo que estuvimos hablando la última vez. Y hoy Ángel no estará con nosotros. Vamos a desarrollar, en este caso, el tema de la acacia. Ya vimos todo lo que tenía que ver con la corona de espinas. Aún había más cosas, pero para no alargar más la temática, lo básico ya lo estuvimos difundiendo, vamos a centrarnos en otro apartado referente a la acacia. Nos va a dar para más de un apartado. Y veréis qué significaciones llega a tener la acacia. ¿Pero dónde? En la Biblia, por supuesto. Pero además en religiones paganas antiguas y en la masonería. Como siempre, era de esperar que si Dios tiene algún concepto en mente, ¿y qué va a hacer Satanás? Si no, siempre sus plagios. Por tanto, deberemos conocer un poco de la historia en general para darnos cuenta de que muy importante debe ser la acacia. Ya veis que en este título nos aparece la acacia, árbol sagrado. Y mirad qué recopilación histórica tan interesante aparece aquí, antes de centrarnos exclusivamente ya en el apartado bíblico. Entre los pueblos antiguos, la acacia era tenida como planta muy apreciada por sus propiedades curativas y la consideraban de suma importancia y eficacia para ahuyentar la mala suerte y los espíritus perversos. Entre los egipcios se creía que la comunidad divina había nacido bajo este árbol y que él decidía la vida y la muerte de los seres. También se la vinculó de algún modo con Osiris, puesto que en las representaciones donde se halla la tumba de este dios aparecen plantados una serie de árboles que pudieran ser identificados con las acacias, que señoreaban aglomeradas a lo largo del río Nilo. En el Egipto antiguo, el cuento de los dos hermanos, que fue escrito bajo el reinado de Ramsés II, hacia el año 1300 a.C., describe cómo uno de los hermanos hechizó su propio corazón y lo colocó en la flor de una acacia, y como al cortar la flor por instigaciones de su mujer cayó muerto, pero resucitó, cuando su hermano encontró el corazón perdido en el fruto de la acacia y lo depositó en una copa de agua fresca. Ya solo con estos breves párrafos nos damos cuenta de que hay una relación para las mitologías antiguas de árbol relacionado con vida, muerte, resurrección. Ya iremos viendo más. En Egipto empleaban las acacias para construir embarcaciones, estatuas y muebles, también en las pinturas y sobre todo como perfumes. El secreto de la acacia es uno de los secretos mejor guardados dentro del mundo de la francmasonería. La idea que el alma humana puede quedar depositada por un tiempo más corto o más largo en algún sitio seguro fuera del cuerpo, ya sea en una planta, animal o en una piedra. Mirad cómo todo esto ya nos va directamente al panteísmo, en definitiva, ¿eh? La acacia en la masonería representa la inmortalidad del espíritu, la inocencia. Es el símbolo de iniciación en los misterios esotéricos, ocupando un valor superior en su ritual por su sentido oculto o hermético. Es la planta que ha crecido y delata la tumba, escondida por los asesinos del gran maestro masón Hiram, ya sabéis, el que ayudó a construir el templo de Jerusalén a Salomón. Su raíz está en la tumba de Hiram y representa la nobleza y pureza de las aspiraciones, la incorruptibilidad de todo pensamiento puro dominado por el sentido permanente de la eternidad. Curiosamente también vimos como Elena White dice todo lo contrario sobre Hiram. La masonería lo ensalza tanto y ella dice que es la causa de las desgracias precisamente de la corrupción que entró en Israel. Si a un maestro masón se le interroga por su identidad, responde: mi nombre es Acacia, que significa he estado en la tumba, he triunfado en ella levantándome de los muertos, y estando regenerado he ganado la inmortalidad. Y cuando dicen la acacia me es conocida, la emplean para indicar que ya poseen los conocimientos iniciáticos que conducen al descubrimiento de la maestría. Para asimilar estos conocimientos, el adepto debe hacer revivir en él la sabiduría. Para los francmasones, herencia egipcia y hebrea, la acacia es el símbolo, como ya he dicho antes, de la inmortalidad y de la incorruptibilidad del alma, y aparece en las ceremonias fúnebres. Solo resucitando de la vida latente, pero adormecida, que despierta con la propia energía que representa el conocimiento de la acacia, se puede encontrar la palabra perdida. En el grado de Rosacruz aparece la cruz en la que murió Jesús de madera de acacia, así como de la misma está hecho el mallete, y su revista es acacia. Por tanto, ya nos damos cuenta que la masonería recoge muchos datos significativos que no nos van a ser algo totalmente fuera de lugar cuando vamos a ver que hay un paralelismo con los escritos bíblicos, pero desde luego, como era de esperar, totalmente desvirtuando el objetivo final, para variar. Los árboles ocupan un lugar destacado en la Biblia. Las referencias arbóreas son reflejo del lugar que correspondía a los árboles en las culturas antiguas. Sus usos, así como su significación inspiradora y simbólica, basada en la percepción del árbol como símbolo de la vida dada por el Creador. Aquí ya empezamos a tocar parte bíblica. Pero veamos aún más cosas. Se cuenta que hay todavía familias en Rusia, Alemania, Inglaterra, Francia e Italia que acostumbran plantar un árbol al nacimiento de un hijo. Se espera que el árbol crecerá al compás del niño y le atienden con cuidados especiales. En Suiza, cantón de Argan, para un niño plantan un manzano y para una niña un peral. En el castillo de Dalhousie, Edimburgo, crece un roble llamado árbol Edgewell, que está conectado a la suerte de la familia por un lazo misterioso, pues dicen que cuando muere o está próximo a morir, uno de la familia se desprende una rama del árbol Edgewell. En el País Vasco, el árbol de Guernica es un símbolo de la nación vasca. Y ahora ya entramos más en lo que es Biblia. Para el pueblo hebreo, la madera de la acacia era considerada sagrada. Algunos creen que la zarza ardiendo era una acacia. Y nos lleva al texto de Éxodo, ya sabéis cuál precisamente, es el de Moisés, cuando ve la zarza ardiente, y allí se acerca a comprobar qué sucede. Pues mirad cómo ya hay gente que ya desde antiguo relacionaba la zarza ardiendo con una acacia. Normalmente nosotros nos imaginamos 4 espinas allí de un matorral y ya está, pues parece ser que era algo más. Sigue diciendo aquí, ardiendo era una acacia que Moisés encontró en el desierto de Naguet. La corteza, las raíces y la resina, la goma arábica, que ya estuvimos hablando de ella también la otra vez, se utilizaban para incienso, y su humo servía para mantener a los demonios y fantasmas a distancia. Claro, esto ya no es cuestión bíblica en sí, evidentemente, esta última parte. Aquí tenéis a Moisés en la cima del Sinaí. En hebreo acacia es igual a Setim, así en el libro de Números, 25.1 dice, mientras Israel acampaba en Sittim, se refiere a la parte del valle en donde muchas plantas de acacias en la estepa, lugar geográfico, ubicado a unas 8 o 9 millas al noroeste del Mar Muerto, tal como aparece en Josué 2.1, se corresponde perfectamente con Isaías 41.19 que dice, en el despoblado plantaré cedros y acacias. Curioso, que vayan juntos estos dos, cedro y acacia. Mirtos y olivos, también. Y en el yermo pondré abetos, olmos y bojes conjuntamente, para que vean, conozcan y comprendan que la mano de Yahvé ha hecho esto, y el Santo de Israel lo ha creado. Isaías invoca un acto creador, y sus palabras están llenas del amor de Dios, con su pueblo elegido transformando el desierto en un vergel. Y aún más concretamente en Joel 4.18. Sucederá aquel día que los montes destilarán vino y las colinas fluirán leche. por todos los torrentes de Judá fluirán las aguas, y una fuente manará de la casa del Señor, que regará el torrente de las acacias. La madera de la acacia es la escogida por Dios para construir el arca de la alianza. Hice pues un arca de madera de acacia, labré 2 tablas de piedra como las primeras, y subí al monte con las 2 tablas en la mano. Así cita Deuteronomio 10:3. Lo mismo se dice en el libro del Éxodo 25, del 10 al 13. Se fabricará un arca de madera de acacia, de 2 codos y medio de largo, codo y medio de ancho, y codo y medio de alto. Harás también varas de madera de acacia, las cuales cubrirás de oro. Ya estamos viendo cómo la acacia aparece en distintas cuestiones relacionadas con la Biblia y precisamente en momentos o en cosas muy específicas y de gran valor. Aquí tenéis también la explicación que da la mesa de los panes, que aparece en Éxodo 25-23. Harás también una mesa de madera de acacia, y pondrás sobre ella perpetuamente el pan de la proposición. El tabernáculo, de Éxodo 26-15, que dice, harás asimismo para la morada unos tablones de madera de acacia que sirvan de postes. Velo del templo, Éxodo 26-31-32. Y harás un velo de jacinto, púrpura, escarlata, carmesí y lino fino torcido, con querubines. Ha de ser una obra maestra, y lo colgarás de 4 columnas de acacia, revestidas de oro. Cortina del templo, Éxodo 26 nos dice, para la cortina de la morada fabricarás 5 columnas de acacias. Y finalmente para el altar de los holocaustos, Éxodo 27:1, harás de madera de acacia también el altar. Según R. Genow, existe una tradición que cuenta cómo la corona de espinas de Cristo estaba hecha de espinas de acacia, desempeñando éstas el papel de rayos luminosos. De ahí el carácter eminentemente solar que conserva esta planta, que está presente en las flores amarillas, especialmente en las mimosas, una especie de las acacias. Ya vimos cómo sí, la corona de espinas de acacia, pero después ya veis cómo hay personas que han cogido esa simbología como lo que después se termina pintando con esos hálitos de luz solar en las cabezas de los dibujos o imágenes de Jesús. Evidentemente, como era de esperar, puede haber una parte cierta, las flores de las mimosas, que son amarillentas, salvo la mimosa borde, que es blanca, y como era de esperar también, se le ha querido transferir a eso los rayos del sol aplicados a Jesús. Evidentemente debemos tener claro que una cosa es la gloria de Dios y la otra, bueno, además de representarse también a sí mismo como el sol de justicia y demás, y otra es toda esa simbología de otros cultos paganos de adoración al sol que después también fueron aplicados sobre Jesús. Y en simbologías como es esto, este hálito alrededor de su cabeza. Dentro del mundo de la magia, Cábala, se utiliza para trabajos de adivinación y trance, y sus flores en magia amorosa. La palabra akasha, de la que se deriva acacia, es la mayor fuente de conocimiento y verdad que el ser humano puede consultar. Ya veis cómo Satanás evidentemente sabe que para Dios la acacia le serviría para transmitir un mensaje a su pueblo. Pues ¿qué tenía que hacer Satanás? Como siempre, desvirtuar todas las cosas. La famosa Arca de la Alianza, la que encontró Ron Wyatt, aquí una ilustración de cómo era, estaba hecha de madera de acacia, sí, recubierta por dentro y por fuera de oro, pero las varas también que jamás se tenían que sacar eran de acacia. Ya hemos visto que en la zona donde Moisés precisamente encuentra la zarza, era una zona donde lo habitual era que hubiese acacias. Y era lógico que si allí se le dice que tiene que erigir un tabernáculo con maderas de acacia y utensilios hechos de acacia, se utilizara lo que tenían allí. Pero además con unas particularidades que ya vimos sobre esa madera, muy interesantes, y que deberían hacer que, por ejemplo, esta arca se conservara hasta los días finales. Y pronto, si Dios quiere, volverá a salir a la luz. Ahora vamos a ver textos bíblicos en los cuales aparece la zarza. Todos enseguida recordamos más o menos, o nos imaginamos esta escena, Moisés con la zarza ardiente, en la cual una voz le habla y era Dios. Vamos primero al libro de la Concordancia Strong, donde vemos todas las implicaciones, o mejor dicho, todos los textos donde se cita zarza con las referencias al lado. No vamos a leerlos todos, vamos a centrarnos en los más básicos, pero ya habéis visto, si os dais cuenta, de que hay distintas referencias, dependiendo de dónde esté el texto. Iremos viendo texto, iremos viendo la referencia que se cita allí para sacar unas conclusiones que, una vez más, creo que no nos van a dejar indiferentes. Éxodo capítulo 3, versículos del 1 al 4. Apacentando Moisés las ovejas de Jetro, su suegro, sacerdote de Madián, llevó las ovejas a través del desierto y llegó hasta Horeb, monte de Dios. Y se le apareció el ángel de Jehová en una llama de fuego en medio de una zarza. Y él miró y vio que la zarza ardía en fuego y la zarza no se consumía. Entonces Moisés dijo: iré yo ahora y veré esta grande visión. ¿Por qué causa la zarza no se quema? Viendo Jehová que él iba a ver, lo llamó Dios de en medio de la zarza y dijo: Moisés, Moisés. Y él respondió: heme aquí. El ángel de Jehová, que después el mismo texto nos dice que es Dios, le habla desde la zarza, una zarza que no se consume. Si vamos a las referencias que nos decía Strong sobre este texto, mirad que aparece la palabra sené, de una raíz que no se usa, que significa pinchar, zarza, por supuesto. Si vamos viendo más abajo, llegamos también al punto de la referencia 5577, sasín, una vez más, de una raíz que no se usa, que significa ser puntiagudo, rama, como que termina en punta. ¿Nos va sonando algo esto ya? Después a la derecha nos dice lugares relacionados con todo ello, pero mirad cómo también esas referencias que nos llevaban nos ponían en el punto 71.51 y 71.36. En el sentido de poner piso, construir ciudad. Poner piso, o sea, poner el suelo del piso. Maderas de acacia. ¿No fue hecho así el tabernáculo? La otra referencia, cara, aligerar, principalmente por accidente, acercar, colocar madera para el techo o el piso. Acontecer, cercano, cumplir, encontrar, encuentro, enmaderar, entabladura, señalar, venir. Mirad cómo, curiosamente, esas referencias sobre la acacia estaban implicando que servía para la construcción de piso o de techo, pero además una referencia a señalar y a venir. Interesante, ¿eh? Señalar y venir. Estamos viendo en los temas de ¿hay fecha para la venida de Cristo? Cómo la señal es algo vital. Pero además, ¿en qué? Vital para su segunda venida. Vayamos a otro texto, Jueces 9, versículos 14 y 15. Dijeron entonces todos los árboles a la zarza: anda tú, reina sobre nosotros. Y la zarza respondió a los árboles: si en verdad me elegís por rey sobre vosotros, venid, abrigaos bajo de mi sombra, y si no, salga fuego de la zarza y devore a los cedros del Líbano. Estamos viendo que es un lenguaje muy simbólico, metafórico, pero vamos a ver qué nos quiere decir cuando vamos a la palabra que allí aparece, atat, de una raíz que no se usa, que probablemente significa perforar o hacer rápido, árbol con espinas. Atat, zarza. Nos damos cuenta de que esa palabra vuelve a ir con una connotación, perforar. Antes hemos visto algo que pincha, que termina en punta. ¿Para qué serviría en construcción la segunda venida de Jesús? Marca o sello. Pero además, perforar. Ya estamos viendo que hay un paralelismo, evidentemente, entre estas palabras que van relacionadas de un modo u otro, y veremos finalmente con qué. Isaías 55:13. En lugar de la zarza crecerá ciprés, y en lugar de la ortiga crecerá arrayán, y será Jehová por nombre, por señal eterna, que nunca será raída. Aquí nos lleva a la palabra ya tan conocida, berosh, lanza, una vez más. Podemos ver ciprés, haya, zarza, relacionado con lo mismo, pero una palabra conjunta para todos, lanza. Ezequiel 2:6. Y tú, hijo de hombre, no les temas, ni tengas miedo de sus palabras, aunque te hallas entre zarzas y espinos, y moras con escorpiones, no tengas miedo de sus palabras, ni temas delante de ellos, porque son casa rebelde. ¿Dónde nos va a llevar esto? Sarap, de una raíz que no se usa, que significa hincar, aguijonear. Espino, zarza. Mirad cómo todas las palabras que os he marcado en rojo nos están dando un mismo hincapié. Lucas 20:37, ya en el Nuevo Testamento. Pero en cuanto a que los muertos han de resucitar, aún Moisés lo enseñó en el pasaje de la zarza, cuando llama al Señor, Dios de Abraham, Dios de Isaac y Dios de Jacob. Mirad cuando leemos ese texto en el Antiguo Testamento, a veces no lo relacionamos con lo que aquí Lucas nos escribe. Se está hablando, al hacer mención de la zarza, con un paralelismo de lo que el Señor es capaz de hacer, y es Dios de personas que ya habían fallecido, y Él los cita. ¿Y de qué modo? Como resurrección de los muertos. Por tanto, resurrección igual a vida, la acacia es igual a árbol de la vida. ¿Entendéis por qué Satanás tenía que hacer todas esas cosas al respecto? No estamos diciendo de que el árbol de la vida fuera precisamente una acacia como tal, del cual se comiesen frutos, pero tiene también esta simbología, acacia como árbol de la vida, porque ¿quién se aparece en esa acacia, en esa zarza ardiente? Cristo mismo. Juan 11:25 dice, le dijo Jesús, yo soy la resurrección y la vida, el que cree en mí, aunque esté muerto, vivirá. Paralelismo total con Lucas 20:37. Por tanto, la acacia era un símbolo, y es un símbolo, para Jesús. La palabra que nos remitía al texto bíblico es batos, matorral espinoso, pasaje, zarza. Con lo cual, ya hemos visto, si cogíamos todas las palabras marcadas en rojo, la zarza aparece en estos textos como una simbología de lo que le sucedería a Jesús en la cruz, ser agujereado en sus manos y pies, aguijoneado en su cabeza y en su cuerpo por los latigazos previos, y finalmente alanceado en su costado. Acacia nos estaba hablando a través de todo el Antiguo Testamento, con las palabras utilizadas, de todo lo que le acontecería a Cristo en la pasión, desde los latigazos, en ese juicio, hasta finalmente todo lo que le acontecería en la cruz, hasta ser alanceado en su costado. Berosh. Recordemos, espinas de acacia de 3 puntas, como veis en la foto. Mirad, recordamos que Ángel nos estuvo hablando sobre esta letra, la letra Shin, que curiosamente tiene 3 puntas, que además era igual a Shem, que era igual a ¿qué? A Dios. Las 3 personas de la divinidad. La acacia de 3 puntas nos está indicando esto. Shem, Dios, 3. Pues bien, la acacia nos va a dar más sorpresas. Y el próximo día, si Dios quiere, veremos otra relación muy interesante que nos va a llevar a otras conclusiones que diremos, ¿cómo puede ser que todas estas cosas estaban en la Biblia y no nos enterábamos de qué relación tenía todo con Jesús? Pero ya sabéis, la verdad tiene que ser progresiva, la luz debe ser recibida por su pueblo a medida que la necesita, y cuanto más al fin, más vamos a necesitar. Y nos damos cuenta cómo Satanás siempre juega esos plagios, siempre hace lo mismo, y así va apartando a la gente del camino, pero dándole unas connotaciones mezcladas de verdad. Y tanta gente sigue cayendo en masonería y en tantas otras cosas. Pero bien, yo doy gracias a Dios, la verdad, porque nos damos cuenta que casi cada detalle escrito en toda la extensión de la Biblia nos estaba apuntando a Cristo. Y ahora, para los que han alcanzado los fines de los siglos, todo esto se está mostrando. Gracias a Dios. Y precisamente relacionado con ese lugar donde se le aparece en la zarza ardiente a Moisés, en el monte Sinaí, la peña de Horeb, todos esos lugares llenos de acacias, vamos a entrar en el pase de unas filmaciones que hizo un matrimonio judío, llamados o conocidos como la familia Caldwell. Vamos a ver en varios días, una parte cada día, hay 4, sobre unas filmaciones que ellos hicieron precisamente en esos lugares, y que, sabéis, es, bueno, yo no sé cómo decirlo, pero es una forma tan clara que, sin citar para nada a Ron Wyatt, resulta que encuentran cosas como decía él. Y aún hay gente, incluso adventista, pastores y demás, que son capaces de decir que lo de Ron Wyatt es una trola, es una mentira. Pues os recomiendo que veáis estas 4 partes. Hoy pasaremos la primera, dura una media hora aproximadamente, pero creo que no tiene para nada desperdicio. Estad atentos, porque vais a ver y a oír cosas impresionantes.
Here's your primetime president and co-founder, Al and Tommy Cooper.
Well, praise God. Tommy and I welcome you to this program, which I believe people are going to find very, very interesting.
Oh, it is. You probably would like to set your recorder. Even if you will be around to watch it, you want to set your recorder. We have the privilege of having Jim and Penny Caldwell, Split Rock Research Foundation, Diamond Head, Mississippi. And they have the most incredibly fantastic story. And I'm not going to steal any of your thunder, guys, but thank you for sending me your book. I can't wait to hear about it in person. And you have been on an incredible journey for several years.
She wouldn't even let me talk to her while she was reading it.
So
Where shall we start?
tell us about yourselves first.
Okay. Well, we are oh so happy to be here. We thank you so much for having us. It is a real blessing to be able to come and sit down and talk with you. We have come up all the way from deep South Mississippi here to Texas, and but we're bringing a story to you from all the way on the Arabian Peninsula.
Yes.
Because there are some amazing things that are being uncovered there in our day and time, and we are only so blessed to have been able to be a part of that. Jim and I lived in Saudi Arabia for 12 years. He took a job there in January of
1987.
in September of 87, and he announced to us that he would be moving our two children, which were then 3 years old and 5 years old, and myself to Saudi Arabia. And I promptly asked him, with what wife were you planning to go? Because I'm not going to go.
She went, but she went kicking and screaming.
Yeah,
I mean, it was literally clawing the asphalt till we got on the plane. And then she couldn't get the door open to get back out once we were taking off.
Right,
so we did
right.
manage.
So he did manage to get me over there.
Yeah, we did manage to get her there. Yeah.
But at any rate, we have so much to be able to share. I'm going to try to just tell you very quickly how we wound up looking for this wonderful mountain on
Okay.
the other side of Saudi
Yes.
Arabia. And that would be a mountain called Jebel al-Lawz and Jebel Makla in Arabic. And we were just... I wanted to say happily working over there in Saudi Arabia, but I wasn't really happy about being there at the beginning, to be sure. But after the Gulf War, the children and I were actually sent out, as were most of the families, during the time of the Gulf War. We lived right on the Persian Gulf. The Scud missiles were actually flying over our home to get to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, and from the first Gulf War. So it was very dangerous for the women and children to be there. To make a long story short, I didn't return to Saudi Arabia until July of 1991. And it was a whole new world after the Gulf War had taken place. And it was very difficult for us in a lot of different ways to readjust to living there. But Jim was working a night shift out at the time was the largest.
Why was it hard to readjust?
Well, everything had changed a great deal after the Gulf War. 600,000 U.S. soldiers were on Saudi Arabian territory, and there was a great controversy about that because Saudi Arabia is considered the holiest Islamic country of all because they contain the cities and the shrines at Mecca and Medina, which are the holiest of all to the Muslims. And the idea that many Christians or other religions,
Pagans.
what they would
Infidels.
consider to be infidels were on their soil. The whole dynamic of the region changed very dramatically in how they perceived us being there. So as we were trying to readjust, and we were almost apart for a year because of what had happened there, and for us to fly back into that and try to get readjusted to the life we had there, which is a very different life living on an American compound.
Sure.
It was very difficult. In fact, we were at each other's throats quite a bit. And it's a miracle that we are still sitting here together with you, I would add. But God had a plan that was so fantastic and so amazingly, we could have never dreamed of something as big as what we wound up being dropped right down into the middle of. Jim worked a night shift out at the refinery, which was the largest in the world at that time, right there on near the Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf on the east side of Arabia. And he went into work one evening, and I went to pick him up at 11 p.m. because he was working a 3 to 11 shift. And when I saw him walking out toward me, toward the vehicle, this is the early part of December of 1991, it was as though his hair was blown back. He was white as a ghost, and I thought, oh my gosh, something awful has happened. But when he got in the truck, he could barely even speak to me. And by the time we got back to our house, which was only a 5-minute drive, I mean, you know, you're right there on the compound, he began to tell me in very broken language just what he had seen. And he had had just an enormous vision. And this was a man who wasn't so sure that visions existed.
I was very skeptical of visions, of people that had visions and then tried to, it may be a vision concerning your life or one thing or another about your, you know, what you're doing. And so visions were, you know, distant to me. I had never had a vision. I went into work that evening, to make a long story. It's very well detailed in her book, by the way, this whole story. But I had a vision that the Ark of the Covenant was being carried through the desert back to the place that it was built, and that I was to go there, and that we were going to find the Ark in a cave. And then the vision stopped. So when she met me, this is just I'm pouring over this in my mind. To be honest with you, I didn't even know where the Ark of the Covenant was built. That was my lack of knowledge of the Old Testament. And I'm telling her this vision and the other things that went along with it, and I'm saying, we've got to go to Mount Sinai. We've just got to go. And she's just saying, what are you talking about? I don't understand. What are you talking about? I said, no, this is so real. It's giving me the chills now. It was so real to me that we have to go there. And so for the next 3 weeks, this was in December the 4th, as a matter of fact, of 1991. For the next 3 weeks, we planned on driving our vehicle across Saudi Arabia, 24-hour drive, entering into Jordan, crossing the ferry onto the Sinai Peninsula, and going to Mount Sinai, which is where we thought it was, of course. And of course, in the Bible, it talks about the Ark of the Covenant and its construction. And of course, it is at the base of Mount Sinai. So this is what propelled us to go to make this driving trip across Arabia by ourselves. I broke all of the cardinal rules of traveling in the desert alone. And I just didn't care. I said, we are going. This is so powerful in me. The drive was so strong that we could not go. So this is what we did.
You know, and initially we did not have a clue that there was a controversy over the location of the real Mount Sinai. I mean, after all, you know, in fact, I'd known people who had gone and made a pilgrimage to the traditional site in the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, St. Catherine's, Jebel Musa. And so we just plotted our course to go exactly straight there. But in that little interim time, that 3-week period of time, I'll just have to explain this to you. Over there in Arabia, customs dictates everything. When you go in, even if you are a Christian or any other religion other than being a Muslim, they don't allow you to have any kind of jewelry or a Bible or anything like that. Now, there's plenty of them there because people smuggle them in all the time. But it's very, very difficult to maintain any kind of practice of what you believe unless you do it behind closed doors. So
everything's underground
right.
as far as the church goes.
We managed to get hold of a VHS copy of the movie The Ten Commandments that somebody had smuggled in, you know, Charlton Heston, the whole thing. And so for 3 weeks, my children are now 7 years old and 9 years old. For 3 weeks, we solidly watched that movie day in and day out. Now, I know that it's not exactly what the scripture says, but you know, for a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, we wanted them to have some kind of concept of why this is so important and why are we blasting off to drive to Egypt to go to this place. And you know, we taught them about the Ark of the Covenant and everything. But Jim was devouring Exodus. And so was I.
I had actually tore the Exodus out of my Bible. I had it amplified and then taped it up so I could fold it up and put it in my pockets and get into the refinery in the evening. Because if you were caught with something like that, you're out of the kingdom. That's it. So we would be, I would get into work, and I worked in the evening shift alone. And so as soon as I made my round, I would be sitting there, and then I would pour through and just reread and see what the geography of this place was going to be like. Get a mental impression of what we were to see when we would go. 'Cause I really didn't know what the traditional site looked like, but what we should see through the eyes of the people that were there. And then, like she said, in conjunction with getting home and with the children watching this movie, the Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, I mean, it built an image in our hearts and minds that we were going to find when we got to the traditional location.
And lo and behold, as we started making this driving journey across Arabia, it was just us and our kids in the truck by ourselves. And we took off from Ras Tanura. I mean, we lived a block from the water of the Persian Gulf.
Wow.
We took off from there. It's about 27 or so hours up to a town called Hakel, which is the border of Jordan. You cross on over into Aqaba, Jordan. At that time, the Israeli borders were not open. We could only get into Egypt on the Sinai by taking what they called the Arab Bridge, or this huge big ferry, the kind that holds 1,000 people and you can drive semi-trucks and cars and trailers onto. So that's what we did. And that's how we wound up on the Egyptian Sinai, headed for Mount Sinai. But what started happening to us as we went along was nothing short of, I don't know any other way to tell you, but supernatural events began to happen to us. One of the most profound, and you'll see in a little while, we have some film and we have some photographs to show you in your viewing audience that are very startling. And one of those things was it actually began to snow on us in a place in Saudi Arabia. Now, granted, it was January, but we were not up in the high mountains. And this event, that's right.
It never snows in mid-Arabia.
Once every
70 to 100
75 years or so, that you might see a snowfall there. And it began to snow on us. And we videoed it. Jim was videoing it to prove to people this is not sleet or hail, this is actually snow. What we didn't realize until he was zooming in with the camera is these little snowflakes that were falling were all looked exactly alike.
Unusual.
That's not really supposed to happen. No. I mean, we learned very young in science that all snowflakes are different. But then it dawned on us, oh my gosh, what are we looking at? Because every single one of them, it was like, if you're a mom, you'll know what I'm talking about. You roll out cookie dough and you take a little heart-shaped cutter and you cut out a bunch of little hearts. Well, these just happened to be a bunch of little six-pointed stars of David. They were all identical. And you don't have to believe me, but I've got film to prove it. And I hope we'll be able to get into that and show it,
We
show
don't
it
have
later.
it with us, unfortunately.
You don't?
You'll have to go to our website.
Okay, actually it is. It is a
on our
live
website.
video you can check on
You
our
can hear the
website.
kids screaming in the background and see the video of it. Not
So-
freeze frame on the snowflakes.
But things like that began to happen to us as we were headed toward Egypt, and we were noting them as, wonder what in the world is going on here. But this continued throughout our whole trip. To make a very long story short, in fact, I'll just tell you, the book, I call the book The God of the Mountain, because there's been a lot of talk about this as a potential, this Jebel Lawz being the real mountain. But the story that hasn't been told is the fact that it's not really, it is about archaeology to us, because that's your initial doorway into understanding that something might have been historically wrong for a number of years. But it's really more to us personally about the leading of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who carried us into Egypt and out again, which is such a parallel to what he did to the children of Israel. Into Egypt and out again. And we began to see these parallels as we went. So what I wrote in the book was every little detail that happened to us, and there were so many of those little supernatural events that, I've got almost a 500-page book, and it's only the first 3 trips we made to the region. So At any rate, we ended up making 15. But what ended up happening, we got to this traditional site, and because it was so fresh in our minds, what the book of Exodus records ought to be there, or at least the lay of the land that ought to be able to contain the tents of 1 million plus people. Something was grossly disappointing as we pulled up through the Wadi systems and pulled up to the traditional site. It was, the first thing I remember being astounded by is, that mountain doesn't look high at all. How could they lose Moses up there? If he's at the top of that mountain, everybody in the valley could see him. I could see the top of the mountain. And so we became very disappointed. Jim and I looked at each other and went,
Something's wrong.
maybe that was not a real vision. Maybe we're just all wet and we built this all up in our minds, and, you know,
A wild goose chase.
it's a wild goose chase, and we just really wanted a big adventure, so maybe we made it all up. Maybe it wasn't as much as you thought. Well, for about the next 3 weeks, we had that much time off, and we actually did the whole rest of Egypt. We drove our truck from Cairo all the way down to the border of Sudan.
Wow.
And back up again. But one of the things that happened to us when we were in the very beginning, entering into the Sinai Peninsula, they compounded our truck and threw it in customs for 2 days, and they would not release our truck. We didn't have the proper paperwork to get our vehicle into Egypt. So immediately
Even though you had gone through Egypt to get there.
Yes.
Well, it was the initial.
It was the initial
trip going across the ferry. When we got to customs, our vehicle was taken and impounded.
Yeah, it was impounded.
2 days.
So we were not planning to exit the country by the same way we had come in. We were actually going to drive up to Alexandria and go across into Israel from that way, because you could get in from Egypt to Israel at that time. You could not get in from Jordan to Israel except by way of Egypt. So because that was back in 1991, 1992, and they had not yet opened up the Allenby Bridge and the various other entrances from Jordan. So we were forced, by virtue of that little detail, which we now know was a complete arrangement from on high, to leave the country by the same way we came in. And so we were on our way back up, back onto the Sinai after having driven all the way down to Sudan. We were at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula in a place called Sharm el-Sheikh. And we were at a hotel there just waiting our time. Because of the nature of the Saudi Arabian laws, we had to stay out of the country a certain amount of days before he, as an employee, was allowed back in the country. So we had about a week left. And we were just sitting at the tip of the Sinai. There's a beautiful underwater reef there called Ras Mohammed, and we're avid divers, and we were just, okay, we've given up the spiritual journey of this because we must have just been all wet about this Sinai and the Ark and all of this. So we were trying not to be too disappointed and just enjoying what had to offer. The hotel had a little gift shop, and it was very, it wasn't a bookstore. There was one little bookshelf, and in that bookshelf I saw something caught my eye, The Gold Mines of Midian. Now this was a reprint of a book that was written by Sir Richard Burton in the 1800s, and he was an explorer of vast portions of what is now Saudi Arabia, but it was the Ottoman Empire at the time. Make a long story short, in the back of this book written in the 1800s, he had hand-penned a map of northwest Saudi Arabia, and he had the land of Midian on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba, squarely in northwest Saudi Arabia. And when Jim and I looked at that, we went, oh my goodness, if Midian in the 1800s was known not to be in the Sinai, but to in fact be in northwest Saudi Arabia, we're looking in the wrong place for the mountain. Mountain's got to be in Midian.
That was a relief as well as a disappointment, I guess.
It was overwhelming excitement. I mean, we all of a sudden re-energized the possibility that we may still be on to something, that this could be real. And the very next day we went back in there, a book that wasn't there the previous day appeared, and it was a great big volume. We couldn't have missed it, but it was called The Mountain of God, and it was by Emmanuel Anadi, an archaeologist that was working in the southern Negev on a place called Har Karkum. And in the very first few sections of the book, he points out that the traditional location is in question, big question mark there, and that one of the possibilities was in Arabia, called Jebel al-Lawz. That was a clue. And then he had a couple pages later an identikit for what you should find if you found the right mountain. And the traditional site fits none of the criteria.
That's right.
And he didn't say anything about Jebel al-Lawz, but we knew through her connection, the land of Midian. Moses was in Midian. He had the encounter with the burning bush in Midian. Let's go. So for the next few days, we poured through these two books and then formulated our trip back into Arabia. We would cross back over the ferry, and then we would get down into this region and look for the highest mountain that we could find and see what might be there.
That's exactly right. And it was, I remember just being wild about, oh, can we leave today? Can we leave today? We've got to get back into Saudi Arabia. We've just got to be able to get back into Saudi Arabia. So that's really the details of that journey and what happened to us day by day is what the book is about. But what we saw when we got there was absolutely mind-boggling. And you know, that term just doesn't fit truly. I don't know how to describe this to you. When we first stood at the base of this mountain that's called Jebel al-Lawz, or specifically Jebel Makla, and again, we'll show you the differences here in the next few minutes. All I can remember is, you know, I have a big sturdy fellow right here, and we stood at the base of that mountain, and his knees buckled out from under him, and the next thing I knew, he was on the ground. And as soon as I saw him on the ground, my knees gave out from under me, and I was on the ground. And it was as though everything that was on the inside of us said, you're home. You're here.
Yeah.
You have found it. Not because of previous lifetimes or reincarnation or anything
Something in your
goofy
spirit
like
says,
that.
This is
But something, there was
connected.
a witness there. Call it a residual glory. I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. But we knew that we knew that we knew.
But the presence of the Holy Spirit was so strong, you
Yes.
couldn't stay on your feet.
Yes. And the very next thing that enveloped us and just shook us to the core was, bring this to my people, Israel.
Wow.
Say it again.
Bring this to my people, Israel.
Wow.
And think of it. If this is the real Mount Sinai, to whom
yes.
would it be the most important?
To Israel.
It's not, well, the other one down south that they think is that, some of them, that's important to them. Even though they have all the discrepancies, and I've
Yes.
talked to rabbis about it, and they said, "Oh, you're all wet. It's not down there." But you're exactly right.
It's really amazing. After being there the first time, we had these moments for about the scope of 45 minutes to an hour, and then the frontier forces, police forces, were on us. Now these are a police force that live in the desert. They are of the government of Saudi Arabia, but they are not like dispatched from a headquarters or something. They keep their headquarters in the desert. And it wasn't very long before they knew that there were faces there that were not local. And
Was there other people there?
we had only
the
seen
local
the local nomadic
Few
peoples, the
tents.
Bedouin. They live all in the region, depending on what time of the year is. They're either closer up in the mountains or they're closer to the sea. And those people have always been, very friendly to us. We had traveled extensively throughout Arabia before we ever made this wonderful trip to Egypt that started all of this. But they'd always been very friendly to us and everything. And to have these forces roar up and pull out AK-47s
Uh-oh.
and say, "Get out," in no uncertain terms.
Were you behind a fence or anything?
Well,
No, not at the moment
Not
that
at
they
the
pulled
time
up.
they came up.
We had been escorted into the area by a Bedouin's young boy, a 10-year-old, had opened the gate, taken us into the guard shack, which was vacated at the time, brought us around to where the pillars were, where what we call this covenant site, and that's where both of us fell to our knees And that was that experience. But after a while, he had gone ahead, he came back to us, and then we walked back around. It's a pretty good walk, it takes about 15 minutes, back around to our truck. By the time we walked up to the truck, here comes the Frontier Forces.
Yeah.
And they jump out, and I cannot express how they tried to instill fear in us and intimidate us and insist that we leave. And I'm surprised that something worse didn't happen, but it didn't, and we were able to leave. But just the point is that was our very first experience at this mountain. We've been back 15 times.
Wow.
In fact,
That's
3
how
weeks later,
important it is.
the other thing that overwhelmed us after we got that kind of a reaction was, who do they think they are?
Yes.
And why are you not allowed?
Yes.
I think what welled up inside of us was like, wait a minute. Not only do we have a perfect right to be here, this belongs to our people.
Uh-huh.
And livid. We were livid. It was like,
Yes,
how
livid.
dare you tell us we cannot be here? But of course, at the other end of the
gun,
weapon,
yeah.
you're not going to argue too much. But
Right.
we kept this internalized.
Can I rewind the tape? What you mentioned pillars. You lost me there.
Right. Moses erected 12 pillars, each one of them representing one of the tribes of Israel.
At that place?
At this place.
And they're still
And
standing?
they're still there. And that's what we're
Well, at
going to
least
show
9 of
you.
them.
9 of them are still
Yeah.
there. And the ground has been through earthquakes and other things, and it's kind of scattered around. But you can still see with not much imagination that this was set up. There was a platform built. Pillars were erected. It's an amazing site. Yes,
And-
still there, 3,500. That's why I think that this site and this
Was
place.
it tabernacle?
The foundation
Yes.
of the tabernacle, we believe we
Really?
Right
have
there.
located where it
Yes.
was sitting. It's the most significant biblical find in the modern era. And nobody knows about it. And what we're here about is
And by
we're
not a
going
biblical scholar and TV evangelist or anything, just plain.
Jim and Penny.
Yeah.
Just plain fiction.
But I want to. I see we've got. We're going to run out of time, and I have a
so-
lot of exciting things I'd like to share with you. So we'd like to roll. There's 2-minute segments. There's a lot of information. People describe it, and I heard someone else say that it's like being hit with a fire hose of information. There will be a lot of information. Of course, we're not going to be able to get to all of it. But I would like to show the first roll-in, which is Sinai and Horeb, and it's going to give you an overview of the whole place.
All right, that's ready to roll. Let's see it.
Horeb in northwest Saudi Arabia, we found ourselves gazing in awe toward the south at the majestic beauty of Mount Sinai. Blackened and different from all its surrounding companions, this mountain stands apart at first glance. As we began our climb up the northern flank of this unique mountain, the dividing line between light and dark granite became glaringly obvious. Exodus 24:17 records that the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on top of this mountain. And now, sitting on Sinai's very peak, the color of these rocks can truly be seen. Coming into view now is the granite peak called the Brown Laws by ancient maps. After extensive research, we believe that Horeb and Sinai are 2 distinct mountains, and that is why they're referred to that way in Scripture. But for now, we'll go back to our view from the top of Sinai, and as you can see here, the valley floor below is enormous and well able to contain the huge numbers comprising those who came out of Egypt. About halfway up the eastern face of Sinai is this hidden valley that can't be seen from below. Exodus 24:9 and 10 tells us of a meeting of the Lord with Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel. They saw God at a distance and as it were a pavement of sapphire under his feet. And glancing upward to where the glassy blackness appears, it's not difficult to imagine a deep blue shine here from the glory of the Lord. Looking all the way down into the camp, we get our first glimpse of the altar to the golden calf. Fenced and forbidden by the Saudis to enter, we would have to devise a plan to get close-up footage of this on another trip. In the same manner, close in to the base of Sinai, we saw the clear image of a double-walled corral leading up to a slaughter area and an altar of earth and uncut stone. Just behind the altar is a dry stream bed running from the mountain all the way into the valley below. Moses cast the remnants of the golden calf into the brook that came out of the mount, according to Deuteronomy 9:21. Here you can see the fence that the Saudis have erected to keep people out of this area. It is extensive and encloses a guard outpost visible here. They are quite serious about keeping the eyes of the world off this mountain.
Wow.
That is a lot of information.
And that's 3 minutes of 6 of the roll-ins that we've brought. But it is a tremendous amount of information. And to watch that just...
Pues bien, ya hemos visto esta primera parte de esta familia, la familia Caldwell, que nos ha hecho una introducción a cómo fueron los acontecimientos que los llevaron hasta este lugar. Es interesante que estas personas, ya veis, están hablando de los años 90, no sabían nada de que Ron Wyatt ya había demostrado que precisamente este era el monte Sinaí, y donde había la peña de Horeb. Y curiosamente también le suceden una serie de cosas sorprendentes que los hace, quieran o no quieran, a tener que volver a ir a estos lugares en más de una ocasión para poder mostrar unas imágenes que desde luego tienen mejor calidad de las que pudo mostrar Ron Wyatt en esos años anteriores, pero que desde luego no hacen nada más que confirmar la veracidad de la palabra de Dios y la veracidad de lo que encontró Ron Wyatt, por más que a algunos les pese. En fin, seguiremos el próximo día, si Dios quiere, hablando sobre la acacia, relacionada directamente con esta zona que estáis viendo aquí, y no solo eso, con algo que también tenía que ver con el pueblo de Dios, para darnos cuenta que siguen habiendo muchas cosas relacionadas entre la gracia y Jesús. Pero bien, eso será, si Dios quiere, el próximo día. Mientras tanto, recordemos, Dios va dando luz, y hay momentos en que cuando se recibe esa luz, uno no se la puede callar, y tiene que seguirla. Y ahora están llegando estos momentos con más fuerza que nunca, porque el fin es cercano, no lo olvidemos. Hay muchas evidencias que mostrar a este mundo para que la gente pueda reaccionar, y todo aquel que sea sincero se dará cuenta. En fin, que Dios os bendiga y gracias.